graduate degrees in history from Miami University here in Oxford, Ohio, where we are today. Since 1976, Steve has worked for the Miami Purchase Association for Historic Preservation, the Kentucky Heritage Council, State Historic Preservation Office, where he oversaw the Ohio Historic Inventory and National Register of Historic Places programs, and most recently, where we are right now, the McGuffey Museum at Miami University, the Three Valley Conservation Trust, and Metro Parks of Butler County. Steve is a native of Ohio, and his research interests include local regional architecture, cultural landscapes, craft and building technologies, especially vernacular buildings and barns, and the study of regional material culture. He's produced several books, including How to Complete the Ohio Historic Inventory, published in 1992, as well as articles on the Ulysses S. Grant birthplace, 19th century prefabricated housing, female architects, Cincinnati's meatpacking industry, maple sugar production in Southwest Ohio, and the historic Spring Grove Cemetery. Steve has written and co-authored over 50 nominations to the Historic Register. Very good. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Steve.
Thank you very much, Devin. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon and also to assist in any way I can, Heritage Ohio. So I'm following the footsteps of one of Ohio's foremost architectural historians, Barbara Powers, who, if you joined her a while back, discussed Ohio architecture. We're going to shift gears a little bit today and talk about rural preservation and reading the landscape, and I'm going to focus on pretty much barns and other outbuildings. It's a fascinating topic, one I've been interested for many years, and there's a lot written about it. So I think as we go through the slides, bear in mind there's probably going to be some kind of article or books or documents out there that will be able to help you identify and learn more about cultural landscapes, especially rural landscapes, possibly not necessarily directly Ohio, but certainly the Midwest. In saying that, I would also add that there's some wonderful ways to obtain publications now through the Ohio link in your library, which you can tap into universities literally across the country, and particularly Ohio. So if there's an obscure journal or some book out there, many times you can get that loaned directly to your local library, who is probably a member of the Ohio link. The slide you see now, I hope before you, has two very seminal books that were written on rural America. The first one, of course, by the right Douglas Hurt, who was a curator of history at the Ohio Historical Society for many years. A really fine book that will introduce you to doing research on the rural landscapes, in particular American farms. Doug, for many, many years, was the editor of Agricultural History. The one on the left is a wonderful story that's really an oral history written by Linda Weidman on the harvest story. And one of the great ways we can learn about our past and our heritage is literally from the words of those people that lived and worked on these farms, and to really understand rural America and particularly rural Ohio. The next slide that you will see coming before you is, I just thought I love art, and I love the way that the rural landscapes are depicted by artists that were either traveling from Europe across the United States, or in fact resident artists living here in the United States. One of my favorites is at the bottom of the page, Wheelock's Farm in New England, painted in around 1822, which shows almost that idyllic, mythical view of the the yeoman farm, early 19th century, very manicured, very neat. It certainly indicates the wonderful productivity, fertility of the farm. It was very organized. You'll see the main farmstead, of course, which is quite prosperous. You can tell by looking at it. One of the things we can learn by looking at the rural landscapes is what kind of agriculture was being practiced at a certain time period. Where were the people coming from that were settling that landscape? Because they oftentimes would bring their building traditions, nuances, and customs with them, and we see that imprinted on the landscape. William Sidney Mount, one of my favorite artists, you see his famous painting, The Power of Music. What's great about this particular painting is it actually shows a timber framing on the inside of the barn where the small group is playing there in the fiddle. But it also shows what we know as the waste wall. And the waste wall was the wall between the threshing floor and the haymow. And when you were threshing wheat or grain in the central bay or the threshing bay of the barn, this prevented your wheat grains from spilling into the other chambers of the barn, and hence it's called waste wall, W-A-S-T-W-A-L-L. And the one in the upper left, of course, is a nice scene, a typical scene of a classic Midwestern farm here in Butler County. Now, the thing that I really love about looking at rural structures, particularly those built before 1900 in Ohio, is they reflect really an age-old, almost medieval building practices, where you have a master barn builder, certainly master carpenters that would oversee the construction of not only houses but barns and outbuildings, particularly barns and outbuildings. These are heavy frame structures that the building practices date back to the Middle Ages, the mid-16th century, and particularly in Central Europe and Northern Europe, where there was abundant, obviously, trees that could be felled for the construction. This technology really did not change that much until the mid-19th century in the United States. One of the things that really revolutionized building construction, of course, was the development of the cut nail and, of course, dimension lumber that could be coming out of large cities such as Saginaw, Michigan, Chicago, Cleveland, Toledo, some of the major urban centers where you could actually have cut lumber shipped by rail to a particular community. But prior to that period, you were very much reliant on local craftspeople and builders to actually build structures for you. Here we see, for example, in 1889, they're doing it for ships, but even as late in 1889 in Northwest Ohio, they're going out in the woods in the wintertime and felling the old growth timber to actually hew the logs and shape the logs for shipment, probably to Toledo, somewhere along Lake Erie, for the construction of various ships. And then, of course, the Swiss settlement in Bluffton, Pandora, Ohio, they had just about finished the construction of that timber frame barn. You can see is quite late, 1904. So the building traditions oftentimes, particularly in the more conservative religious communities, tended to stay longer than they would have maybe in the communities that were closer to the urban centers. Now, I think it's important that you understand a technology if you're looking at rural preservation and understanding the landscape, because technology had a dramatic influence on field patterns, the size of fields, the size of farms, the types of barns that were being built. Generally speaking, by the 1840s and 1850s, we see a pretty dramatic increase in the productivity of Ohio farms. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is the development of the mechanical reaper. Obed Hussey, of course, and McCormick, two of the most famous. There were many patents for mechanical reapers, but really by the 1840s, we see a pretty dramatic shift in the amount of productivity that could be done on a particular farmstead. And this is reflected certainly in the size of a lot of our barns. We also see the enlargement of dairy herds, and the immigration of the Germans had a pretty big impact on the size of our dairy barns, which you will see in some of the slides. One of the things I particularly like to do is try to go back to the journals of a time period and look at the original sources and some of the commentaries and articles and diaries that were being written about Ohio farms. I should mention that the American Periodical Series now has available a completely digitized format of the Ohio farmer, going from, I believe it's the 1840s up until, I believe probably until the 1920s is when I use it. So you can do a keyword search and it'll pull up, for example, if you're from Delaware, Ohio, you can search in Delaware and it'll pull up everything in the Ohio farmer. And sometimes you might actually find a farm mention that you're doing research on. So the Ohio Farmer, the Ohio Cultivator, the Country Gentleman, there are a lot of great agricultural journals that I would recommend that if you're interested and you want to learn the original source material, that's an excellent one to go and look at. Now, some of you may live in counties that have very good tax records. And we happen to have very good tax records here in Butler County in the southwestern part of the state, particularly the auditor's records, the tax duplicate records, where they will actually specify if a barn or corn crib was on a particular farm during that year when the farm was assessed. And of course, other structures such as grist mills and the house as well. And you can track the assessment of the buildings, and that will help you determine the size of the building and also maybe when the building was built or if major improvements or enlargements were made to the buildings. I think Mercer County, I remember Marianne Olding did some wonderful, and Mrs. Hopkins did some great research up there years ago, and they were using tax records that are actually on the Ohio Historic Inventory form. So again, I would check to make sure what kind of records your particular county has in the assessments. Now, I can't underscore enough the importance of Ohio's position and context in American agriculture as a whole during the 19th century. Under Governor Celeste, I think we had a slogan that was called Ohio, the heart of it all. And this is so true when you look at our industry and our agriculture in the 19th century. When I meet young people today, I know they might be going to Silicon Valley in California, San Francisco and the Valley. It's considered the great place of opportunity for young people. But in the 19th century, if you're a young person and you really wanted to make it, whether in farming or in industry or invention, really Ohio was kind of at the crosshairs of that kind of opportunity. And I think it was one of the Wright brothers who said, I had the good fortune of being born in Ohio to two good parents. And I think he understood the importance of where he came from. And in looking at this particular slide here, you can get an idea of how the state fit into the national context. Of course, corn and wheat were the two major small grains that were being produced in the United States for that time period. The darker the shade is the more intense amount of agricultural land devoted to that crop. And you can see Ohio by 1880, particularly western and northwestern Ohio, in the eastern edge of that emerging corn belt. And then, of course, you look at the wheat production there, we're right up there. So this is reflected in the prosperity of our farms, the size of our farmsteads and our barns. We were a very prosperous state. We're fortunate in Ohio today to still have an incredible inheritance of agricultural structures. I believe our peak in around 1920 was 220,000 family farms in the state. We're probably down in the 60,000, 65,000 now. But a lot of the barns and outbuildings and historic structures still remain on our farmsteads. And we're fortunate to have that inheritance. Trying to go to the next slide here. All right, sorry for that little delay there. There's a little bit of a lag time there. But again, I thought I would show you by 1880, which was really kind of the high point for the state, some of the top counties in terms of production. And if you're from these counties, you can get an idea even today by looking at the rural landscape that you had a very robust and prosperous agricultural economy. That wonderful dairy belt up there, wheat and dairy in northeast Ohio, Stark and Wayne County. You can see that in 1880, Stark County led the state in the value of all its farms and outbuildings. Northwest Ohio, I pulled out Paulding County because the Great Black Swamp had not largely been drained as of yet. So that rich, fertile land had not been quite tapped into at that time by 1880, but that would quickly change by the 20th century. And then get an idea of the number of farms between 100 and 500 acres. You're looking at Licking, Tuscaroras. Again, a lot of smaller farms, but a large number of those farms. A little slow going through. Thank you. All right, and this slide here, if it's come up on your screen yet, you will see what I like to do is also try to find a little bit more about the people that were settling in these counties, particularly native versus non-native or foreign-born populations, because as you well know, many of the foreigners, particularly the Germans and the Swiss, that were coming to the rural areas in Ohio brought again with them some interesting building traditions and building types. And we see this reflected clearly in Mercer County, Germany. We see a lot of them in Sandusky, Seneca, Stark, Tuscaroras. Get a lot of the really wonderful Schweitzer barns, the big double bay barns. that are up there, and of course the Swiss settlement over in Tuscarawas County. As I mentioned earlier, I like to try to go back to as much of the original sources, some of the print material. Now, bear in mind, one of the difficulties with rural architecture is a lot of the building traditions were passed down orally from father to son and from son to grandson and so forth, and a lot of it wasn't written down. They just knew how to build these structures from memory. They were trained at a very young age, so there isn't a lot of formal education that necessarily took place. It's not like in an urban area where you might get some more people that were well trained to design buildings, more pattern books. We do have some, but again, I think the agricultural journals are a really great source. One of the most important books in the late 19th century was called Recyclopedia, where he actually describes a three-bay barn, which you see in your upper right. The three-bay barn became that classic, iconic barn in New England. Some people call it the ground barn, where you had a very small center bay, threshing bay, and then equipment on one side and maybe horse stalls, and then hay mow on the other side. The Register of Rural Affairs on your left shows a classic Sidehill, or what we might call a bank barn, that you see all across the Midwest. Ohio, again, I keep coming back to that same important theme, a center of agricultural production, not only because we had so much agriculture here, we had a lot of agricultural implements and a lot of agricultural innovations and technologies that developed here. One of the most important was the hay track that was developed by Myers. I think they're still in business in Ashland, Ohio, a very important industry there. The hay track had a big impact on, again, the size of the barns, the efficiency of farming. It allowed farmers to make much bigger hay mows. Instead of having to pitchfork every single wagon load of hay, they could actually have a giant hay fork that comes down through a series of pulleys and horsepower to move the hay off the hay wagons directly into the hay mow. There was another big one, I believe, in Canton, Ohio, called the Nay Company. So they were very important as well. Here's a slide that talks a little bit about another very important barn type that Bob Ensminger, who for many years was in Pennsylvania, the authority on what was called the Pennsylvania barn, which is a very distinctive and important barn type, particularly in the areas in Ohio settled either by Germans or by people that were coming over to Ohio from particularly Maryland, Northern Virginia areas, through Pennsylvania, and then settling into the parts of Ohio. They brought that wonderful basement and upper haymow barn type with them, known as the Pennsylvania barn, and a subset of the Pennsylvania barn known as the Schweitzer barn or Switzer barn, named after Switzerland, not Germany. And that became and still is a very important barn type in Ohio. The basement barn here is seen in the Genesee Farmer, which is upstate New York. The Genesee Valley, some of you may know, was one of the original wheat belts in the country, very rich area. And so what happened is a lot of the New Yorkers, and this also was a key area for the construction of the Erie Canal as a way of exporting all the grain from the Genesee Valley and moving it west to Buffalo, and then either going to Minneapolis and other places along the Great Lakes. But this is a very important barn type in Ohio. And again, when you see this type, I would generally say that you're looking, one, at a very prosperous farm, dairy farming almost for sure. Very likely you have some kind of Germanic or Swiss influence on the construction of the barn. These barns are superbly built. I just attended the Ohio Barn Conference here in Butler County, and I'm just always astonished at the incredible craftsmanship that goes in these structures. Rudy Christian had a wonderful comment about these barns. He said, if you want to see what the old virgin forest looked like in Ohio, just look in your barns. We were in a corn crib where we actually counted the tree rings in one of the logs in the corn crib, and Joe Steiger counted them. Joe had counted 273 rings in this one log. It was chestnut. And so he basically said, you know what, this was a seedling back in the 16th century. It's just astounding to think that those kinds of trees are still there. So one of the things we try to do and I think talking to landowners is always the most important way to do preservation, because a lot of times they don't realize they have an important building on their property. It's just always been there. They kind of take it for granted. But when somebody from the outside comes and talks to them about it, and I think shares information and also appreciates and values their building, that might change the perspective. We had several examples on the barn tour where, because of barn visits in advance, the people had decided to repair their barns rather than demolish the barns because of the interest and the value of those structures. Years ago, I remember Barbara Powers saying, if we don't value our buildings, then probably they're not going to be preserved. So our challenge we face is to try to work with other people and encouraging them and instilling in them the value of these irreplaceable structures, because this is how we learn about our communities, we learn about the peoples that settle Ohio, and also the intrinsic value of the materials in these buildings, which you cannot replace. For example, the barn, if you were to get a piece of wood and repair it, you would go down maybe to Lowe's or another building supply, and you might get a 2x4 that has 4 growth rings on it. You know, it's made of fast-growing, soft southern pine. But if you kept the old roof rafter, which was old-growth understory wood that had been in the forest for decades, obviously you're going to have a much better quality of materials. So this is one of the things we talk about in preservation is know your materials, do all your research and think very carefully before you make that very important decision to tear down or remove a property. Now, I mentioned here about the hay track. This is a wonderful slide showing in 1876, of course, was our country's centennial, showing the construction of the barn, how the timber frame worked, how the farmers would actually stack the hay in the hay mower, and I've always been amused by the young lady in the hay mower on the right stacking the hay. So this is a description more of a good country barn. There was a great deal of emphasis on barn design, location of the barns on the farmsteads. You probably heard of the Courtyard Plan, the Linear Plan, which Fred Niffen and other cultural geographers have talked about. These are pretty important farmstead types in Ohio, you know, the linear being more mid-Atlantic. You'll see it right along the country roads where the barn and the house are all in alignment, whereas the more popular form or plan is what we call the Courtyard Plan, where the house is dominant, and then in the back you'll have literally a courtyard or the main barn, maybe a corn crib and some outbuildings, wash house or summer kitchen, sheds, privy. This is a very important type, of course, in Ohio. This is one of my favorite farmsteads in Ohio, up in Stark County, and there was a book that I came across years ago that had this incredibly wonderful scene drawn in 1885 of the Yoder farm in Stark County, and I was just thrilled to death when Jeff Brown told me that the house and the barns were still standing and in still very good condition. But you can see the pride that this particular farmer has in the farmstead. Again, it shows that very stereotypical, well-groomed, well-fenced, well-organized farmstead from the 19th century. We're not talking about a hard-scrabble farm here. This is a very, very prosperous, well-to-do farm, even showing the imbricated slate roof on the farmhouse there with the lightning rods, the Norway spruce trees in the front. Now, if you're very lucky, you might find wonderful records kept by farmers or landowners that may have been handed down through the years. We worked on a nomination up in northwest Butler County where we actually found some of the tax or insurance records for this particular barn in 1912. I mentioned a shingle roof barn valued at $1,000. We have a barn down here in Butler County that I happened to stumble across an article that was in the Breeders' Gazette back in 1884 describing this barn. One of these show barns, what you might call a gentleman farmer. This is not your typical barn. This is a one-of-a-kind, but what makes the barn distinctive, if you look at the photo on your upper left, you'll see the beige-colored base of the upper barn. That actually is actually houses 3 rectangular concrete silos. They were basically planned to put fodder and silage in for the cattle. This was a cattle barn. This was not a horse barn or a hog barn. This was for beef cattle, not dairy cattle. And the barn is still there and lovingly preserved by the property owner, and I always try to give her a vote of confidence, telling her how much everybody appreciates the repairs that she's done to the farmstead and how much she keeps it. So here's the original profile elevation from 1897 in the Breeders' Gazette, and then an old photograph there and a description in the local newspaper. So again, you want to try to combine the archival materials, the research that you're doing with the actual, what I would call the structural analysis, or reading the property, reading the building itself. And that means you have to really try to get inside and look very closely at the construction of the barns, whether it's a corn crib, a shed, or a barn. The only way you really know these structures is by getting inside them. And for houses, if you can, I highly recommend the basement and the attic if you can also, because usually the first and second floors, lots of times you can't see the construction too well, or it's been modernized. Now, silos, interestingly, some of the earliest silos were here in Ohio, particularly in Northeast Ohio, and some of the rectangular silos, as many of you may know, are still very much in use up in Geauga County, portions of Lake County, Ashtabula County, and those are very interesting structures. But they never quite caught on because, as Hubert Wilhelm once said very aptly, that you really can't make good kraut on a square churn. It has to be round. So the square silo didn't catch on quite too much, but the round silo did. And there are a few of what we call the wood stave, wooden silos from the very early 20th century that still manage to survive. One of the reasons is because a lot of this is western spruce or Doug fir, or cedar, and these woods tend to be more resistant to rot. They're very solid, durable structures. And we've got a wonderful heritage of silos in Ohio. There was a company in Springfield, Ohio, that I think was called the Ross Silo Company that did a lot of silos. The Marietta Silo Company in Marietta manufactured most of the concrete stave silos that you see on farms around Ohio. So again, Ohio is right at the center of industries and companies that were making agricultural products and agricultural supplies. Now, this particular slide that you'll see coming up here is a wonderful farmstead listed on the National Register up in Perry Township in Montgomery County. This particular property is something we see quite often. The farmer that bought the farm after World War II, tended the farm very carefully, raised a family there. All the buildings were well maintained. It was a diverse farm. Many crops, cattle, milk cows, hogs, chickens, all the buildings were being used. Unfortunately, and so sadly, the matriarch and patriarch have since passed. The children had moved on, so they're not sure what to do with the farm. Right now, it's currently being tenant farmed. But, they have tenants in the farmhouse, and the challenge is trying to find somebody that's going to really take care of the farm, because the tenants typically don't really care for the buildings as much. The barn is being used by a local school district to house some of their smaller school buses, but it's no longer being used for farm operations, at least none of the structures. So that's a challenge for us. This particular farmstead, though, has just got tremendous documentation. And as I said, listed, I think it's an 80-acre farm listed on the National Register. This gives you an idea of the wonderful canted purlins, a type of construction on these barns. There's not a nail anywhere in the framing for this particular barn. This is all done with old world mortise and tenon joinery. It's time tested and proven. You can see the barn's been there since I believe the 1850s. It's got the double tie beams. You can see how it's hewn. So that means this is all craft built. This is, again, not lumber that you're going out to Lowe's or your building supply to get. They're actually people that would labor to shape these particular timbers and then raise the barn. And they didn't build barns for obsolescence back then. They were built to last. And on the particular farm is a wonderful, very long, narrow structure that is a tobacco barn, and a very large one for Montgomery County. But I enclosed the map on the upper right showing some of the different tobacco growing areas in Ohio in 1879. And you can see, obviously, southwest Ohio. You can see where it touches over in Kentucky, and then eastern Ohio, Jefferson County, Monroe County. There was a tobacco, flue-cured tobacco there. In western Miami County, western Miami Valley there, of course, Dayton in there, and Dark County, parts of Preble County. So that's all reflected on the map. This is an example of the flue-cured tobacco barns that you still see, although in declining numbers, in far eastern Ohio. Smaller farms, obviously, but some of those valley floors like Captina Creek and Belmont County, some of the other bottomland was very fertile, very productive for tobacco, and this was flue-cured like they do in North Carolina. So you would actually have little fires in the barns, whereas a lot of the barns in southwest Ohio, in Adams, Brown, Highland, That's what's called white burley tobacco, and that's air cured. It's a totally different type of tobacco. This is a farmstead here in Butler County. It was built by a very important German Mennonite settlement here into Butler County in the very early 19th century. It's locally known as the Augsburger settlement. Part of it is much of it is on the National Register. It's well known locally. The wonderful 1875 atlas illustration that's since been colorized of the farmstead. The house and barn still stand. They're currently owned by Metro Parks of Butler County, and it's a very important center for agricultural programming in our county. This particular one, I'm moving somewhat chronologically here in barns, where you're starting to see the transition from hand-hewn, more custom built barns to the emergence of what some people have called dimension lumber barns, where you can actually start seeing more standardization of the barn frames, a little less, what's the word I would use? There's more homogeneity to a lot of the barns by that time period, because people are starting to actually buy plans of how to build barns, so there's tends to be more similarities. This particular barn here describes a wonderful late timber frame barn up in Elyria, Ohio. This comes out of a major book done by J. Sanders in 1892, and Practical Hints of Barn Building. I included this slide because I've always loved this barn. You can barely see it from Interstate 75 to the west in Wood County near Signet, I can't remember how it's pronounced. Just a magnificent barn, particularly the cupolas, which are not just decorative, they actually are important because they allow the humidity and the moisture to come out of the barn. When you have a large dairy herd in the lower level of barn, you can imagine how much methane and moisture these cows let out. And so it's important that you make sure that your barn is, the air is well vented out, also when you have a large quantity of hay. And then, of course, I put the little image there of Gathering Winter because it reminded me of that barn up in Wood County. Just an absolutely spectacular structure. I cannot imagine ever losing a building like this, and I think the owners are very understanding of its importance. This particular barn here, Chamberlain, I believe he was in, I can't remember for sure, I think it was in the Hudson area. It might have been in Richland County, I'm not sure. But he was a major agricultural writer, and he did a lot of articles from the Ohio Cultivator and the Ohio Farmer, Country Gentleman, and this is a classic, what I call a raised basement barn, where you have the ramp coming up to the barn. Raised basement barns were built on more level terrain, but in order to get the cattle and livestock on the lower level, you had to raise the barn up. Usually it's almost always a stone foundation on your lower floor, and then you have the ramp that gets you up to the hay mow and where all of your implements would be stored. And this is a wonderful book, Radford's Combined House and Barn book by 1908. You're starting to see the tail end of the heavy timber frame barn. This is one of the last publications that gives you that classic timber frame barn profile that you see across much of the northern United States. I'll just pause here for a second and say it's so important that we recognize that many states just don't have the agricultural heritage that we have. You can drive for miles and not see a historic structure on the landscape. But here in Ohio, largely because of our survey system, the early settlement of the state, the incredible fertility of the land, and the density of population here in the mid-19th century, we just have an abundance of fabulous structures that I'm constantly discovering and realize just how wonderful. I'm going to kind of go through some of these slides a little more rapidly because I'm keeping an eye on the clock here. I want to open this up for questions for Devin. This is a wonderful illustration of a barn up in Greene County near Cedarville. So again, a lot of these major farm journals in the 19th century almost always have examples of Ohio farms and structures profiled here. This is a Sidehill Barn. This is typical of the types of barns you will see, particularly in east central Ohio when you get over into Tuscarawas County, Harrison County, Belmont County, Jefferson County, Monroe County, where you start getting much more hilly topography. You'll see a lot of these wonderful three-bay barns built at the side of a hill. I call them a side hill or bank barn. This is a really wonderful gentleman farm over near Yellow Springs, just north, which is now the headquarters and office of the Tecumseh Land Trust, one of Ohio's foremost conservation trusts. Whitehall Farm or the Kelly Farm is really one of those classic gentleman farms where they were really experimenting with all types of barn construction, whatever the newest technology was, particularly concrete at the turn of the 20th century. Really significant farmstead, and the good news is this farm will be, at least the land and hopefully the barns will be protected by a conservation easement. And that's one of the things that I work on now with landowners, is try to put their land and some of their buildings into conservation easement to protect them for future generations. This is a patent for an interesting plank frame barn awarded to an Ohio farmer in Seneca County, and this barn's on the National Register. One of the titans of barn design in the northern United States during the late 19th and early 20th century was a man named John Shawver from Bell Fountain. I can't say enough how important his barn designs were all across the northern United States. He was really one of those people that just became known as the Shawver Plan. And basically the Shawver Plan was using primarily 2x8, sometimes 2x6 planks that are bolted together as your barn frame. And you know, intuitively it sounds like, well, gee, that wouldn't be very sturdy. But interestingly, these barns were so well engineered that many have lasted since they were built. They're very solid structures, and they're important to preserve them as well. These were very popular, particularly for dairy barns, because you know the dairy barns are getting bigger and bigger in the hay mows, and that basically you had to have an open hay mow for the hay track to work, and a lot of your timber frame barns were not well designed for hay tracks. This particular structure here, I thought I'd put it in there. I just came across a wonderful article in the Michigan Farmer, a rat-proof corn crib, and it caught my eye right away. And it just happened to be a corn crib that is located about, I'd say, a quarter mile from where I live outside here in Oxford. And I immediately called Jack Fryman, the owner, and I said, Jack, can I come down and look inside your corn crib? Because I got a feeling that this is the corn crib described in the article in 1883. So the article talked about the vertical oak lath siding that you still see there. Remember, this was built in 1875. That siding is still there. All of the description that was in the article matched perfectly with the way the barn was built, including the doors, which the current owner replicated. As you'll see, those doors there are new doors, but he used the same design that was on the original corn crib. Heavy timber frame. By that time it was sawn. There was a large sawmill nearby, so there was no need to hew the beams. You could actually saw them. And he was very, very pleased to get the article. And this is the type of thing that we need to do as preservationists, is share our knowledge and share our information with the people that actually own these structures, because sometimes they will be our biggest advocates. In fact, most of the times they will, for preservation. And I try to always thank people for repairing and preserving their structures. You know, an attaboy or a vote of confidence goes a long way to people. They like to know that the work that you're doing on historic buildings is appreciated by people in the community. This one is a wonderful, I thought I'd end up here in a couple slides, some real success stories that we've had. We had Barbara may remember this particular property, the Lanes Mill Historic District here in Butler County. Unfortunately, again, Mrs. Manrod was getting very up in years. She had a lot of land but not much cash, and allowed most of the buildings to go in disrepair. The bad news is the stone grist mill was lost. We're very, very saddened to know this. We just couldn't find a way to raise money to save the building, but we did get a new owner that purchased the farm and is basically now raising pedigreed livestock, cattle and some horses on the property, and has invested a great deal of personal money into the preservation of the barn, which she just loved. I knew the minute I met Cheryl that this farm and this barn was going to be preserved, because she fell in love with it. She had an emotional attachment because she recognized how beautiful these structures are. This is one of the earliest sawn frame barns that we know of, that I personally know of in Ohio. We have dated it to 1853. It's the Elliot Lane barn. Because of the manure had piled up so much under the forebay that a lot of the posts had actually rotted out from the manure. And of course, one of the first things she did is remove all the manure from the basement level of the barn and also around the posts, and had sawn posts put in of tulip poplar, good solid wood. So she's done a marvelous job on preserving this particular barn. This is the last slide I'll show. I had the pleasure of working with a wonderful firm down here in Southwest Ohio who specializes in a lot of timber frame, log, and historic barn preservation and renovation. This is a barn over southeast of Dayton near Bellbrook, which they completely redid the siding, and then they worked with a subcontractor to put on an authentic standing seam metal roof on the barn. The owners had contacted this company and said, you know, we don't know whether we should just tear the barn down or is there enough there to warrant preservation. So again, the company they work with, and I won't mention them because I don't want to make this sound like it's an endorsement for them, but they are a great firm. If you want to know who it is, you can call me and I'll tell you. But they explained how really well built this barn was, and the basic problem was a corner of the roof had, you know, the classic where part of the tin roof had peeled away and one of the corner posts was rotten, and there was some rot inside. There were some issues with moisture on the back wall, but overall the barn was a lot better condition than it looked. So it was kind of the ugly duckling syndrome. You know, externally it looked really beaten up and pretty bad, but the bones were strong, the bones were solid. And they just basically said, you know, by the time you pay the cost for demolition and then you pay the cost, because you can't just burn it on site there. You know, EPA won't allow that anymore. You have to haul this all the way to the landfill. You got tipping fees. You have to worry about what you do with the foundation. There's all kinds of expenses that go into demolition, not to count the loss of the energy and the resources that are there. So they said, why don't we work with the structure to preserve the structure? And that's the success story here. And they are using this, I think, now just basically to store some of their vehicles and some of their other equipment that they use, lawnmowers in the lower level. They just want to preserve the barn. I think they appreciate how important it is. Now, having said that, I also understand that it's important we find uses for these barns for farmers and for agricultural people. And that's where the Barn Again program comes in. We've had great success with that. So you have to get to know your landowner, what their needs are, what they see of the future of their property. And then sometimes you can bring in another person who may be able to rent the barn for space. They'll be willing to do that. You might have a tenant farmer that needs space for combine or tractors or other equipment, hay balers, and that way they'll be able to use the barn. So I want to thank Heritage Ohio, and particularly Devin, who drove all the way down from Columbus today to do all the IT work on setting this up. It's a real pleasure to join all of you, and I want to thank Heritage Ohio for the great work they do. And if you're ever in the Oxford area, I would love to have you come to the McGuffey Museum. It's a National Historic Landmark, and McGuffey was really a pretty important guy in Ohio history. So I want to thank you all very much, and I think Devin's going to set it up now for questions.
Thank you, Steve. Another wonderful webinar. Right now, you guys, if you have any questions, you guys can start typing them in down in your little chat box. We'll receive them as they come in. So while you guys are typing in your questions, I got a couple announcements for everyone. First, Heritage Ohio would like to thank you all for attending today's webinar. If you enjoyed today's webinar, please think about becoming a member of Heritage Ohio and supporting Ohio's preservation and revitalization movement. To become a member and to learn more about membership, visit our website at www.heritageohio.org to become a member today. Now, since this webinar is very pertinent to something, I felt we should share that our nominations for Heritage Ohio's annual awards are currently being accepted. And particular interest to all of you is the Historic Farmstead of the Year Award. The award is issued to the historic farmstead that embodies the marriage of modern agricultural practices with historic buildings, or best embodies the innovative use of historic agricultural buildings. Nominees will be judged on the basis of maintaining integrity of the farm buildings and outbuildings for continued use, or the completed rehabilitation of a farmstead for either agricultural use or for new sympathetic use. So to submit your nomination for this award and to view all other categories for awards this year, please visit our website, heritageohio.org. And finally, you can join us in Chardon on June 15th to learn about what can be done to help foster a sense of pride in your community and address civic self-esteem issues. Find out how people around the state helped their cities and towns become more confident in their work and showed pride in their community. To register, visit our website, heritageohio.org. All right, let's see what questions we got going on here. Who wants to pull out? There we go. Not seeing any questions yet. I'll give you guys a few more seconds if you guys have any questions. I mean, Steve was very thorough, so I can understand how you don't have any. But we'll give you guys a couple more moments here. Steve, do you have any final remarks while we're waiting?
Well, I just think that one of the things that people recognize when they come to Ohio is our wonderful rural landscapes. Obviously, you have great cities, but Ohio is one of those rare states that not only has incredible urban fabric, but we've got great rural landscapes side by side. So that's really a gift that we have, an inheritance that we have in this state, and that's why I still live here. I don't want to move to Seattle or someplace. I like it here. I'm a Midwesterner. I love Ohio, and I think that it's important that we take great pride in where we live.
Right, we do have one question here, and it's for me. Hi, Erica. Yes, we do sometimes. I'm not sure about this one. I'm filling in for somebody who's away at a conference, but I will email you to let you know if there are any continuing education credits available for this webinar. If there are, I'll email everyone to let you know how you can get those. But typically, we announce it beforehand if there are, so I'm going to guess no on this one, but sometimes we do. And you guys will receive an email from me within the next day or so. I'll send everyone a copy of this webinar so you can listen to it again and share it with whoever you'd like. Since this is a Preservation Month webinar, these are all free this month. So I'll let you know shortly, Erica, about that. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions yet. Oh, okay. Clarifying Erica's question here. In the future, yes. There will be some more webinars on these topics. I'm not sure of the current schedule coming up, but they happen intermittently throughout the year, Laura. And I know in the past we've dealt with landscape architecture before. At our conference coming up October 10th through 12th in Cincinnati at the Hilton downtown, there will be some sessions as well. And I'll email you some information on that, Erica, just so you have that for you. All right, I'll give it another second to see if any other questions pop in here. And if not, you guys are free to go. Oh, I'm not seeing any more coming in, so thank you again, Steve, for doing this webinar today. It was a fascinating and wonderful webinar, and please, all of you, remember to visit the McGuffey Museum next time you're in Southwest Ohio. I can tell you from personal experience standing in the place, it's a very beautiful museum, a lot of interesting artifacts to look at, and plus Oxford is a beautiful community to visit as well. So we're dropping off college kids, weekend away at Cincinnati, make your way over here to the McGuffey Museum in Oxford. Thank you all for joining today. We hope to see you in our next webinar.